This video is going to use UI to construct this proof. It's a pretty simple proof in terms of the new rules, but still study this video. It shows some important features about the transition from Chapter 8 to Chapter 9 and how to use those same old rules from Chapter 8 now that we're in the predicate logic. When you approach proofs in the predicate logic, the first thing is still the same as it was in Chapter 8, which is just take stock, take a look. And for that matter, if you're still more comfortable in ordinary language, come up with some translations that will help you think through the argument. For example, here, just to keep things simple, maybe we want to think about line 1 saying that, Bobo and Fanny are both mammals, and premise 2 is more complex, but really just follow the basic templates. We have a universal quantifier over a horseshoe with a negated consequent. And so in sort of more natural English, this is a statement like, it's a none statement. No mammals or reptiles are plants. These are purposely kind of silly, but it's just to make the logic of the argument really clear. And so then our conclusion, of course, is that, well, Fanny and Bobo are both not plants. Depending on where you're at with the predicate logic, the advantage of looking at an argument in ordinary language is that it might help you see the reasoning a little better. Because here, of course, we see that basically this is kind of like a modus ponens proof. Premise 2 makes the claim for all individuals that if they're either a mammal or a reptile, then they're not a plant. So since Bobo is a mammal, then Bobo's not going to be a plant. And since Fanny's a mammal, then from premise 2, we're going to know that Fanny isn't a plant either. Right. Now again, in ordinary English, that's happening so fast in your brain that you probably aren't noticing it. But this is a carryover strategy from Chapter 8, which is sometimes thinking through the logic of the proof is actually what tells you how to construct the logic proof. So basically MP is our strategy. Now, of course, though, the first problem is that we don't have the resources for MP. In fact, line 2 isn't even a conditional yet. Because of these parentheses, the main operator is the universal quantifier, and so the horseshoe's actually inside the universal quantifier, and so we can't use MP yet. Of course, if we want to use MP, we just need to somehow get the conditional version, right? And now that we're in Chapter 9, we know how to do that. We just use UI. But here's a basic tactic. Whenever you have generalizations, whether universal or existential actually, think about instantiating them. Now the reason for that is simply because in most cases, but not all, we're going to want the embedded formula to use with the other rules of proof. Whether it's MP or whether it's DS, for example, we need horseshoes or wedges, respectively. And as long as that quantifier is outside, right, has the largest scope, in other words, right, we don't actually have horseshoes or wedges and so on and so forth. Now here's another strategic question. Whenever we instantiate with UI, we write over the basic formula and we consistently replace all occurrences of the variables with a constant. Now here's the thing though, with UI and also EI, except there are some restrictions on EI, we have a choice of which specific individual to use as our instance. And this is where the strategy comes in. Line 3 is legal. After all, line 2 is a universal generalization, and so M or R, then not P, is going to be true for every single individual in our universe, provided that line 2 is actually true. So there's nothing illegal here. The problem is that we want to use modus ponens. And by the time we get to use it, notice that we have a problem. Our antecedent is MA or RA, but what we actually have at line 5 is MB or RB. Here the lines in question in isolations is going to be 3 and 5, and at line 3 we derived that, for example, Alfie, for Alfie, if either Alfie is a mammal or Alfie is a reptile, then Alfie isn't a plant. And at line 5 we have the claim that Bobo isn't a mammal or Bobo's not a reptile. But in ordinary English, it should be very clear. Alfie has nothing to do with Bobo, at least as far as we know, and Bobo has nothing to do with Alfie as far as we know. And so modus ponens isn't going to be valid. So modus ponens derivation here isn't going to be valid based on what we've got so far. Now, the thing is, there's an easy fix here, and that's simply at line 3 we had the choice of individual constants. And so why not just instantiate with Bobo? And then now suddenly we are completely back in business. Now, you don't have to trial and error this the way that I just demonstrated. The indication is clear from the get-go, right? From the fact that Bobo and Fanny, or B and F, are the individual constants that are appearing in line 1 that we're going to want to use B and then F as our instantial letters. And so when you're setting up a different proof, if there's a mix of singular sentences and generalizations, just pay attention to what those individual constants are. Those are going to be your first choice for instantiating any of your generalizations. It's the same thing working backwards, right? If the conclusion includes Fanny and Bobo, then in the proof, any of your instantiations is likely going to need to use Fanny and Bobo. Now, before we move on, I want to take another look at line 5 as well. So in isolation, at line 4 we had a sentence, and then at line 5 we are adding in a disjunct using add. And here, recall that the rule for add just says, given a sentence, derive it with any other disjunct to form a disjunction. Right? And so we're doing the same exact thing here. We've got a sentence, and we add in any disjunct. And here, of course, what disjunct we add from a strategic point of view is determined by what's in the rest of our proof. That is to say, for example, Bobo is a mammal, or, I don't know, Alfie is a reptile. This sentence is a legal use of add, because by add we are permitted to add in any disjunction whatsoever. But again, if we think about why we're adding, which is in anticipation of using modus ponens, then of course we don't want that Alfie is a reptile to be added in as the disjunction. Right, and I'll just do it here just as a contrast. This is also add on line 4. This is also legal, right? But this is line 6 down here is the strategically desirable add step. At line 6, we've got half of our desired conclusion. Our desired conclusion is a conjunction. And so again, back from chapter 8, chances are we're going to get each side, right? And then use conj. And so we've gotten one side, so now we're really just looking to see if we can get this side. And again, it's going to be basically modus ponens, but the question is, how do we get to the claim that Fanny's not a plant? And just to be clear here, I cannot, for example, do something like this. Line 3, 5, MP again. Okay, let's look at this in isolation just to make sure we're all on the same page about this. Line 3, says that if Bobo is either a mammal or a reptile, then Bobo is not a plant. Line 5 does give us the ingredients for modus ponens because it tells us that Bobo is either a mammal or a reptile. But here at line 7, I've attempted to derive that Fanny isn't a plant. But kind of the same thing as before. What we know about Bobo has nothing to do with what we know about Fanny, and so this is, in ordinary language, sort of horribly bad reasoning, right? Just because lines 3 and 5 say true things about Bobo doesn't tell us anything about Fanny. But it's also, very illegal from a rule point of view, simply because what modus ponens allows us to do, of course, is given a conditional whose antecedent we have on a line by itself, we're permitted to derive the consequent. But of course, that's not what we did here. So instead, what do? Well, actually the same process as up here, but with a new individual. That is to say, with Fanny. So, UI on line 2 again. If Fanny is either a mammal or a reptile, then Fanny's not a plant. We know that Fanny's a mammal from line 1, simp. So we, excuse me there. So we also know that either Fanny is a mammal or Fanny is a reptile. Right, this is just 8. Add. And once we have that formula, then we're able to derive the consequent using modus ponens now on 7 and 9. And of course, now we've got our other side. And so now we just make our conj move, right? And that's going to end up being 6 and 10. And that's not PF and not PB. Okay.